The opposite process of melting is called pivot. In melting, we turn columns into rows. Now, in pivoting, we will take each unique value of a variable and turn them into separate columns. One reason we may want to pivot our data is to reshape our data from an analysis-friendly shape into a report-friendly shape, or when our dataset violates a tidy data principle, where rows do not contain observations, specifically when multiple variables are stored in the same column. Here's an example from Hadley-Wickham's tidy data paper. We have a dataset of min and max temperatures for a particular date. You can see how the min and max temperatures are reported in separate rows, causing the dates to be duplicated. We want a dataset that gives us a date for each row. That is, a date is an individual observation, and for each date, we have the min and max temperatures. Here is the tidy dataset after the element column is pivoted. You can now see how the new table follows the mantra of tidy data. Every row is an observation, and every column is a variable. To pivot our data, we call the pivot method on a data frame. We pass in the index to denote which column or columns we want to fix during the pivot. Next, we pass the columns keyword argument for the column we want to pivot into new columns. Finally, the values to be used to fill in the new columns created from the pivot. You may find that the pivot method will not always work. Here is our original weather dataset with another weather dataset I've saved as weather 2. The second dataset has a duplicate tmin for February 2nd, 2010 date value. If we simply use pivot on the second dataset, you'll get a value error, saying that there will be duplicate entries and cannot be pivoted. That is, there are 2 tmin values for February 10th, 2010. Python has no idea how you want to reconcile the duplicate values. This is when we use the pivot table method instead of pivot. The pivot table method allows us to provide a parameter that will tell Python how to aggregate these duplicate values. I'll show you how to take the average of the tmin values for February 10. Pivot table is very similar to pivot. We call the method on a data frame of interest. Pass in the values keyword argument for the values that will be used to fill our columns after our data is pivoted. The index represents which columns we want to fix during the pivot and the column we want to pivot. Finally, we need to address what happens when there are multiple entries for a given pivoted variable. We use the ag_func for aggregation function parameter to tell Python how to handle multiple values. Here I'm using the mean function from the NumPy library to take the average of the values. Now it's your turn to tidy data using the pivot method.